Welcome. Our guest today is Brian Urquhart, a soldier, an international civil servant, a biographer, and a commentator on international affairs. Brian Urquhart was Undersecretary General of the United Nations, the author of biographies of Hammarskjöld and of Ralph Bunche. His autobiography is called A Life in Peace and War, and he's a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books. Brian, welcome back to Berkeley.
Very nice to be here.
This is the 100th anniversary of Ralph Bunche's birth, and you were just in UCLA to celebrate that anniversary. He was an extraordinary individual, a scholar, a peacemaker, a Nobel laureate. If he were around today, what would he be telling us about the world situation and America's role in the world today?
Well, I think that, if I may just say two sentences about Ralph Bunche, because he tends to be rather forgotten. He's one of the, I think, one of the most creative and important international figures of the last century, and probably one of the most important people in the United States. He was one of the early founders of the civil rights movement. He wrote a great deal of An American Dilemma, which is the still, I think, a very important book on the problems of race in the United States. And then he went to the UN, where he, among other things, founded the trusteeship system. He was the only person who got a written agreement between Israel and her Arab neighbors for 30 years, the Armistice Agreements of 1949. He also invented peacekeeping. It wasn't called peacekeeping then, but he did invent it. So he really has done rather a lot, and all of these things people have heard of, but they've never heard of him for some unknown reason. And the reason partly is he was an extremely modest man. To my mind, he was the absolutely perfect public servant. He was a person who minded about the job, did not mind who got the credit, was extremely leery of publicity about himself, and just got on with it. And incidentally, he never changed. He was just as modest and funny and unpretentious when he was extremely grand as he was when he was a young man. So I just want to introduce you to Ralph Bunche, and I hope you'll think about him. It's the 100th anniversary.
We should mention that he was a black American and a graduate of UCLA.
Yes, that's right. He started at UCLA. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned. I'm sorry to say he never came to Berkeley, but I just he would have liked it if he did. If I may just mention one thing, you asked about what he would have thought about the present situation in the world. Well, I think he must be turning in his grave. He would, I think, be appalled at some of the policies that we have everywhere in the world, not just in the United States, but in the Islamic world and in some other countries as well. He would certainly believe that some of the, I think he would be very shocked by what has happened in the Middle East between Israel and Palestine. He was the mediator in Palestine in 1949, and as I say, he concluded the Armistice Agreements, which for 20 years were the only peaceful arrangement in the Middle East. And I think he would be very upset. I think he would also be extremely uneasy about the policy of preventive war. And as a matter of fact, just before I came here, I came across a quotation from his, the speech he gave in accepting the Nobel Peace Prize in 1950. And it may ring a bell with you. May I just read it?
Please.
This was quite a longish speech. But now, let me just say that in 1950 there were people in Washington who believed that we ought to finish off the Soviet Union before they developed nuclear weapons, and this is what he's talking about. It was the ultimate preventive war. There are some in the world who are prematurely resigned to the inevitability of war. Among them are the advocates of the so-called preventive war, who, in their resignation to war, wish merely to select their own time for initiating it. To suggest that war can prevent war is a base play on words and a despicable form of warmongering. The objective of any who sincerely believe in peace clearly must be to exhaust every honorable recourse in the effort to save the peace. The world has ample evidence that war begets only conditions which beget further war. Well, that's Ralph Bunche. That was 54 years ago.
How would you compare Bunche's generation, and you work with him He was your mentor. You worked with Eleanor Roosevelt to the present leadership group of the United States. I mean, it's such a different view of the world and such a different view of the role of the UN.
Well, I think there is a huge difference. I think that the idea of public service in the United States was much more developed now than it is now. I think people think about politics now, but they don't necessarily think about public service. And someone like Mrs. Roosevelt, or indeed Bunche, were primarily public servants, and they believed in it. They did not believe they were in it to become immortal or to get some huge reputation. Or even Bunche is the only person I know who turned down the Nobel Peace Prize, incidentally. And then he was told rather sharply by the then Secretary General of the UN, who was a Norwegian, that he was ordered to accept it, but he didn't think that it was relevant to what he was doing. I think also you have to remember that the United States invented most of the current ideas of internationalism. They invented the League of Nations, which was swept away. They invented the United Nations, which was the special project of Franklin Roosevelt. Throughout the war, when he had, goodness knows, enough things on his mind, he was constantly thinking about the world order after the war. And what came out of that was the United Nations Charter, which, as you know, was finalized and signed here in San Francisco. I think that people like Bunche and a lot of other people, leaders in the United States, believed that the role of the United States in the world was to lead and participate. And by that means, people would go along. It is extraordinary to think that in 1945, with the exception of the Soviet Union, every country in the world wanted to get with the United Nations because the United States urged them to do it. They did not have a feeling that the United States in some way was trying to dominate them, because the United States was the champion of decolonization in the world. And therefore they did not have a feeling that an empire was being thrust on them, a new one. And things have changed very much, I think. And I think that is a pity. And I hope we get back to the idea of participatory leadership for the world's most powerful country, because without that, I think everybody is going to suffer, including the United States.
In a recent essay, or one of your many essays in the last decade, I should say, you quote Arthur Schlesinger Jr. as saying, "The isolationist impulse has risen from the grave." He's talking about the United States, and it has taken the form of a new unilateralism.
Well, this is a hotly disputed statement. I got into a lot of trouble with that, because the new unilateralists say they're not isolationists, they're just exceptionalists and unilateralists. I'm not quite sure what the difference is, but this is a label that does not go easily on people who are exceptionalist United States leaders. I think it's, but I think it's true. It's a different shape of isolationism. It is the idea that the United States is a totally exceptional country, which, though it makes the rules, should not be bound by them. I don't know whether you followed the sad history of the International Criminal Court, which is a new organization, incidentally, designed to deal with runaway maniacs like Saddam Hussein. The United States, at least the current administration, has completely denounced the court and has strong-armed all the countries of the world to make an exception for United States citizens to the International Criminal Court. The likelihood of a United States citizen coming before the International Criminal Court is virtually zero because of the nature of the charter of the court. But I thought, I must say, if they wanted to invade Iraq, it would have been a very good idea to have indicted Saddam Hussein in the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity, which God knows he's committed. And maybe that would have been a slightly more reliable basis for doing something about it, but they didn't do that.
So then is the issue the terms upon which it chooses to lead the world? Is that the problem now, as opposed to that post-war generation?
I think it's partly a problem of attitude and partly a problem of policy. I think the attitude, and I hate to say this, of the current administration towards other countries is wrong and has had the most horrendous repercussions as a result. I mean, from being the most respected and admired country in the world. If you look at the various opinion polls which the Pew organization and other people have done, it's really terrible, the change in attitude, and that is because they are treated as fools and babies. And people, nobody likes to be treated as a fool and a baby and an idiot and possibly a criminal as well. There's a sort of accusatory attitude, which I don't think is sensible. I mean, it applies particularly to the United Nations. It seems to me very odd when you couldn't get a majority in the Security Council, and you couldn't get any kind of majority in the General Assembly if we're going to war in Iraq, that it should be said that the United Nations had failed the test. It seemed to me it had rather won the test. They'd done something quite sensible. And I don't, and at the same time you're preaching democracy, which we hear a great deal about now. I think that, it's the attitude that's the problem. You have to respect other people, you have to respect other religions, other societies, other ways of doing things, and then you can probably get everybody's attention, because this is the most powerful country in history. There's never been anything like it. But to make that really have an effect, you have to have the right attitude to other people.
What do you make of the notion that the U.S. would self-confidently assume that role? That is, that of an imperial power in the world, but also the world sheriff, basically.
Well, I think you've just had an English historian, Niall Ferguson, here, who has been, I think quite wrongly, urging the United States to pick up where the British Empire left off. This is a dead duck if ever there was one. I mean, don't touch it. For one reason, I think imperialism, as it used to be, is a completely dead concept, because the whole world has woken up to imperialism and they don't like it. And therefore, wherever you go, whether it's Iraq or any other part of the world, and you try to exert an imperial kind of grip on things, people are going to oppose you, and they will oppose you and oppose you and oppose you until you get sick of it and go away. So that kind of imperialism is dead. The United States boasts that it's never had colonies, which Mr. Ferguson thinks are the basis of empire. I mean, his gripe at the United States is that it's an empire which doesn't have colonies, and therefore it's not really an empire. I think that the United States is right about that. But you do have a lot of things which are imperial. You have an imperial culture. English, I hate to say it, is an imperial language now in the world. You have God knows how many foreign bases. It's over 50 or 60, I think, isn't it? It's something enormous. You have a hugely increasing military budget. And you do have now a notion, which I think is extremely dangerous, that the United States has the right to go after anyone who it believes may become a threat to the United States, and go after them with war. Now, if everybody else in the world takes that up, we're going to be back to the jungle in a very short time. There's not a single country in the world that I can think of, except possibly the Scandinavian countries, who don't have some potential threat to them from outside. Everybody else has got at least one. Some have got about 6. And if everybody were to have a preventive war policy, well, I don't know where we'd all end up. I mean, I don't think you'd all be here. So I think this is crazy. I don't think that's empire, though. I think that's something new.
What you're suggesting in a lot of your writings is that the UN was seen by the U.S. as a place where it could realize its interests by cooperating with the rest of the world. And you make the point in one of your articles that even as powerful as the U.S. is, it requires the legitimacy of the world community. It needs to cooperate in a way, not only because it can't do the job alone, but that's the only way that you can win the support and legitimacy that the UN can offer.
Well, I think we are seeing a remarkable example of that right now in Iraq. You may not remember, but about nearly a year ago, the UN was pronounced irrelevant by George Bush. But now, because of this whole point of legitimacy, the UN appears to be the only group of people who the Iraqis are prepared to really go with when it comes to really important things like elections, writing a constitution, trying to get the whole structure of the state put back together again. And they are dealing, incidentally, with a perfectly remarkable person at the moment who's called Lakhdar Brahimi, who is the former foreign minister of Algeria, who has been holding things down in Afghanistan for the last 5 years, and particularly the last 2 after 9/11, and now appears to be stuck with going to Iraq and doing the same, because the main leaders in Iraq, some of whom are religious leaders, say when it comes to this kind of thing, they want to discuss it with the UN, because that is a legitimate international organization which represents, theoretically, everybody in the world.
Is it fair to say that the world community confuses what the UN can do with what it should do? Isn't that a continuing problem?
Yes, I think so. Well, it's a problem, actually, of all governments, too. But this is swept under the rug when we're discussing the UN. I mean, if you look at the platform of any incoming leader in any democratic country, and you compare what comes out after 5 years, you will see that the government hasn't exactly lived up to the platform, and probably never will. But in the UN, that's considered a failure. And I say this not defensively, it's just a fact. Having said that, the UN is based on several completely false assumptions, and the most serious one is that the great powers, the 5 permanent members of the UN, which are no longer the 5 most powerful countries in the world, but never mind that for the time being, would get together and keep the peace, and if necessary, enforce it by arms. That's the basis of the UN Charter. And of course, the truth is that very powerful countries don't always agree with each other. In fact, the 5 permanent members during the Cold War were the main threat to world peace, because with the East-West, the Cold War and everything, you had the permanent members completely split, and they were pretty well paralyzed. And the UN has to live with that, because unfortunately the veto in the Security Council was the absolute indispensable thing for both the United States and the Soviet Union. They would not have joined the UN if they had not had a veto in the Security Council, because they were not prepared to face another situation where they could be dragged into war on a simple vote, and a simple majority vote. And I think we still have to, it's still true. The only trouble with the Security Council has another problem now, which is that it's a museum piece. It represents the geopolitical balance in the world in 1945. And France and the United Kingdom, I'm British, but I have to say it, are not by any standard ranking world powers anymore. They're very nice countries, but they just aren't large. You know, when you think of India or Brazil or South Africa or some of these other countries, they just aren't there. So that I think one has to look at the UN, therefore, as a very flawed affair, but something which is still immensely important, because it represents legitimacy, international law, without which we're all eventually going to get into the ditch. And it represents a place where in emergencies you can actually do something. And that something will be accepted even by people outside, even those who would not accept an intervention by the United States or any other single country. And that, I think, is an important thing to get on with, and we have to do it. And also, of course, it has the Secretary General, who is an extremely, potentially a very important person, because he's a person who is endlessly engaged, and due to the different international time zones, I would say almost 24 hours a day engaged in what is called quiet diplomacy, which is seeing something which is likely to blow up and trying to avert it, and trying to figure a way you can avoid a huge explosion, which will probably catch on to something else. And I think that is something that's not often appreciated, that you do have the international part of the UN, which is extremely effective, and incidentally very, very inexpensive.
It could be said that the architects and designers didn't anticipate a lot that the UN was going to confront. You made the point of the Security Council being based on the balance of power at the end of World War II. The whole problem of decolonization was something that was anticipated to take maybe 25 or 50 years, and it really happened right away, which then increased the membership in the General Assembly quite a bit.
Well, a lot of things weren't foreseen. Nobody who wrote the Charter, with possible exception of President Truman, knew of nuclear weapons. They hadn't gone off then, and I don't know whether Truman even knew. He'd just become president, and I don't know. And that really has, to put it mildly, slightly changed the way the world runs. And is going to change it even more, I think, in the future, because now you have the really devastating prospect of proliferating nuclear weapons, sometimes not even in the hands of governments. And if that happens, that is going to be terrible. So it's a the Charter was written for a very different world. Nobody forced. I was told by a very pompous so-called Mandarin in the British Foreign Office, people like that are usually wrong, and he was wrong again, said, you know, don't worry about decolonization, it'll take at least 100 years. Well, thanks a lot, it took 20 years, and that trebled the membership of the UN. I mean, there was a whole new group of countries who never had ever heard of in 1945, the so-called Third World, which had a majority except in the Security Council, and had different concerns. They were concerned with poverty, development, and this kind of thing. They weren't concerned with peace and security, anything like as much as the original signers of the Charter had been. And I don't think that anybody had any idea in 1945 that the world's population was going to go rocketing up the way it did. And I don't think that anybody had foreseen, of course they hadn't, the information revolution, which is an enormous change in the way everybody leads their lives and the way governments operate or don't operate, and in what people actually think about things. You know, when the Charter was signed, it took nearly a week to get from Europe to the United States. And now you can do it if you take the Concorde in 3 hours. So that it's well, that's gone, of course, too. But I mean, there are these huge changes, and governments are very slow to adapt to these changes. Big corporations and business are very quick to adapt to them because it's a better way to make money. But governments don't think like that. They take forever. And I think this is where, maybe I'm jumping the gun here.
No, please.
I think this is where it is perhaps foolish to claim that the current administration in Washington is completely against internationalism, multilateralism, and all that. These people have taken a tremendous shock. 9/11 was something inconceivable. It was a monstrous attack on people in this country. It's not happened before. And I think this completely shook everybody in Washington up. They sometimes see bogeymen and horrors where they aren't, but they are very concerned about a number of things. They're concerned about the speed with which a horrendously destructive act can take place. It can take place in a matter of, well, in the case of nuclear weapons, a matter of 40 minutes. And they believe that the apparatus in the UN is not up to that. And therefore they have to, I think it's the second part of the proposition is disaster, therefore they have to do it themselves. That's no good. But the UN has got to shape up and has got to really get to the point where it can respond quickly and responsibly when there is genuinely a major threat. I don't think Saddam Hussein was a threat. I think he was a horrible man, but there were lots of other threats much more dangerous. I mean, Pakistan was much more dangerous than and still is, than Iraq. But we mustn't say so, of course, because it's an ally. But the truth is that this is a country which may become an Islamic fundamentalist state and which has nuclear weapons. And incidentally, it turns out to have been peddling nuclear weapons all around the world. So that that's a really dangerous situation. But I think there is something in the to my mind, misguided kind of, whatever you call it, politics of Washington. And it is true that the current international instruments were designed for a totally different world, a slower, far less destructive world. And you have this has got to be changed.
There are three core problems, I guess we could say. The proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, not just nuclear weapons, chemical and biological. The problem of the networking of terrorist groups, non-state actors, that for various kinds of reasons may aspire to use these weapons. And then the problem of failed states and rogue states. Rogue states, because they're in the business of providing weapons to anybody who will buy them on the one hand, and on the other, failed states like Afghanistan before the war, where they become a haven. Can the UN, the international community, address these problems in a way so that the sheriff, namely the US, doesn't have to act alone or think it has to act alone?
Well, I think it does have to do, and I think if the UN doesn't face up to these things and find out ways in which it can function more expeditiously and more effectively on things which it wasn't supposed to do anyway, then it's going to get left behind. I say it with deep regret, having spent a great deal of my life working for it, but you know, it's no good having an organization which aspires to do something which is looking in the wrong direction. But I think there is a sign. I mean, after all, the UN has done a great deal of nation building in the last 15 years. Since the end of the Cold War, 14 years. And it wasn't something it was supposed to do. I mean, it was exactly what it wasn't supposed to do. It'd been working within the boundaries of states all over the world, sometimes with success, in which case you never hear about it, and sometimes with different degrees of failure, in which case you hear all about it. I mean, for example, Rwanda or Bosnia or Somalia were disasters, and we all know about them. Nobody's ever heard about Angola or Mozambique. No, I don't mean Angola. I mean Mozambique or Cambodia or 15 other countries where the UN has been essentially doing nation building. And it is getting, this wasn't something that the UN was supposed to do. It was supposed to function between nations. It wasn't supposed to function within them. But now, of course, rogue states and failed states have become tremendously important it isn't just nuclear proliferation either, it's all sorts of other things, money laundering and drugs, and also they're very dangerous in something like an epidemic. If you have areas of the world which are under no control at all, this is a tremendous problem for the World Health Organization, and because epidemics now communicate themselves much more easily due to the fact that people travel all the time. And so I think these are all things which I think are being thought of, but governments are very slow to give up their little freedom to act or not to act, which is supposedly sovereignty. And they've got to be persuaded, and otherwise, if the United States goes its own way, I think it's going to be a mess for the United States. Because, you know, how do you really choose which place in the world is an imminent threat to the United States? And we now know that intelligence isn't too much good in that, and it will continue not to be any good. This doesn't work anymore. I don't think it's, and supposing the United States goes after, I don't know, it can't go after North Korea. There's no way it can do it. Libya appears to have dropped out. So poor old Syria is left. I don't think they're a huge threat to anyone except possibly themselves. But it's you know, we've got this sort of fictitious list of the axis of evil, and I think we've got to get away from this sort of propaganda, sort of speechifying stuff, and really think where this is. I mean, Somalia, I would have thought was a major candidate for being the headquarters of Al Qaeda, if which is a huge if, they get thrown out of Afghanistan. And it isn't just nuclear proliferation, it's all sorts of other things that matter. So that, and I think that the United States will be far better off to try to do this sort of thing. Now, let me just say one thing about the UN. I worked there for 41 years. It is one of the most irritating, frustrating, and on occasions downright damn silly organizations you can possibly imagine. If you can think how foolish people in the Congress or the Houses of Parliament make them, what fools they make of themselves in public, and multiply it by 200, you've got the UN. And you have to aim off for that. This is something that's going to happen. It's a representative institution, and representative institutions make asses of themselves in public, nationally and internationally. They always do. So we have to get, but there is working within that some very important stuff. There's a lot of extremely important private diplomacy which goes on 24 hours a day. There's the Secretary General and the Secretariat, who actually, contrary to the general belief, are rather effective and not, incidentally, a great bloated organization. The worldwide Secretariat of the entire UN system, which is all the specialized agencies, the bank, the fund, and the UN, is smaller than the public service of the state of Wisconsin. So let's just be a little bit careful about the bloated business. It's not very efficient, I have to say, but in some respects, because it's recruited from all over the world, and you have to work a lot to get a sort of common standard going, but it does work. I mean, the World Health Organization is an extremely valuable organization, as we now see when we get these scares about chicken flu and SARS and all that.
You told me a story yesterday evening that I actually would like for you to repeat, which was at the time that Iraq invaded Iran, you encouraged the Secretary General to do something. And tell us a little about the reaction, because it's a good case of how we have a sense of international norms, of the way the world, we would like the world to work, but we're dealing with power politics. And so tell us about what you proposed, what happened, and what the response was to by the American and British ambassadors.
Well, this is really a personal story, but it makes the point very well. I forget, when did Iraq invade Iran? 1980?
Yeah, I think that's right.
I'm sorry to say it was in the Carter administration anyway. And this was a flagrant case of aggression. I mean, they simply poured across the border into Iran with no provocation, no pretext, nothing. And I got the then Secretary General, who was the regretted Kurt Waldheim. I was then the sort of, was running all the sort of conflict control business in the UN. I persuaded him to call an emergency meeting of the Security Council, which he did. And I got into, I've never received so many insults in my life. They said, the British and the Americans said, what on earth do you think you're doing? I said, well, you know, this organization, you weren't here then, but this organization was set up, its primary objective was to stop aggression. The primary objective was to stop Hitler, Mussolini, Saddam Hussein, whoever it was. And it doesn't matter if you don't like the victim. If you might as well, you guys in the Security Council might as well go home if you discriminate between the victims of aggression. That's not what it says. They said that's all soft-hearted nonsense. So let these people fight it out. Of course, they hated Iran. For various, well, the obvious reasons, the hostages and everything else. And I've never been so ashamed of my own country, not to mention the United States, which is my sort of adopted country, in my life. It was terrible. And they did this, and of course they were wrong, because they let Saddam Hussein, well then of course, being very inefficient and having a monstrously poor army, he didn't manage to defeat the Iranians. He inflicted terrible damage on them. He used chemical weapons, missiles, God knows what. And eventually had to, after 10 years of massacre, had to give it up. I think that was the reason why he invaded Kuwait. And that's, I also think, the reason why he didn't think anything was going to happen last year. Because he thought the UN was a paper tiger, the United States was the biggest paper tiger in the whole zoo. They weren't really going to do anything. And I'm sure it came from the fact that when he did something patently and flagrantly wrong, for which there's absolutely no excuse at all, nothing happened. In fact, the United States, I'm sorry to say, gave him helicopters, intelligence, means to make chemical weapons, the whole lot. It was an ally. And Mr. Rumsfeld and people all went there. And he was our trusted friend. So I was quite amazed when suddenly we began to hear that he was worse than Hitler. It seemed to be a bit late.
Let's talk a little about the Iraq War and use this as a vehicle to grade the UN. The build-up to the war, the debate in the Security Council, and so on. How do you evaluate the international processes that occurred? Of course, the U.S. got mad, didn't get its way, and went on its own. But were you pleased with the way the UN in that build-up to the war acted? I mean, was it meeting its mandate?
Yes, I think it was. I mean, the UN is supposed to be not just one country; it's a whole number of countries, and the Security Council, after all, is 15 countries. And the whole object of it is to get a consensus on doing something which can be very important and sometimes very dangerous. I don't want to judge who was right and wrong. I mean, it's perfectly possible, though I doubt it, that Iraq in the long run will prove to be a huge success. A democratic Arab country, secular, functioning, and so on. Though judging on current progress, I doubt it. And also judging on previous experience, it was the British, my compatriots, who were very good at creating insoluble problems, who put together Iraq. It wasn't, under the Turks, it was 3 separate provinces. But the British thought it would be a neat idea to have a new country, so they did that. And the oil played some part in that. But anyhow, now we've got it. Nobody's ever been able to make it work. I think that the Security Council probably did what it had to do. I think that some of the things that were done were very foolish. I think that it wasn't just the United States who failed in a diplomatic approach to other countries. I think, for example, I think France was unnecessarily provocative due to the character of the foreign minister, Monsieur Villepin. I don't know what the Germans thought they were doing, but every now and then they said something which they didn't need to say, which just made it worse in Washington. It confirmed the views in the Defense Department that foreigners were fiends that should be ignored. And that was a very dangerous idea. I don't think that, but by and large, I think it had to do that. A lot of countries genuinely believed that this was a very bad idea, and if you were going to do it as on the reasons given, which were that Saddam Hussein was an imminent threat with weapons of mass destruction, you had to be extremely sure that those weapons actually existed, and they didn't. This was a fantasy. There's a wonderful new book, incidentally, which I was talking to Harry about last night. It's by the chief UN inspector, Hans Blix, who is a very canny Swede. And he was running the inspections, which finally got stopped because the coalition went into Iraq. And I must say it's devastating in a way, because it turns out that none of this existed at all. What existed was a shoddy, broken down, pathetic country run by a deluded, very brutal, extremely corrupt dictator. They couldn't do anything. The army was a joke. They had no weapons. They destroyed them, curiously enough, under UN inspection in 1991. But when they said they destroyed them, of course nobody believed them, because we had, after our erstwhile ally, Saddam Hussein, after 1990, when he went into Kuwait, was demonized to such an extent and said he was the most terrible man in the world and so on, which I think he probably was. It was a pity we didn't realize it a bit sooner, but nothing he said or his government said was ever believed at all. And when they said, look, we destroyed all these things, we wanted to get the sanctions lifted, they were no use to us anyway, we have destroyed our weapons, and you people, the inspectors, actually blew up most of the stocks, including the entire nuclear establishment, and took the fissile material out and flew it to Russia. Nobody believed this at all. And I mean, I think there was a reason for going into Iraq, and it seems to me it was as I mentioned before, it was the crimes against humanity. This was a terrible regime. It was a kind of a festering sore in the Middle East, and it really wasn't bearable, particularly since they had used all sorts of weapons against Iran. But I suppose you don't always get a perfect result out of a representative institution. You know, people have different views. That's the whole point. And I thought that it was very unwise to say that it was irrelevant, because it was perfectly clear to me, even at the time, and to everybody else who knew anything about Iraq, that they were going to desperately need all the help they could get to get them out of Iraq. It was easy enough to go in and take Baghdad, though, and it was a triumphant military affair. It was brilliantly done. But to stay there and to try to make something of an incredibly difficult country was something else. And they were going to need all the help they could conceivably get, which has now turned out to be true. The idea that you can establish sort of, Lakhdar Brahimi, who was the guy who just went out there to try to get some way to fix this business about elections, said the other day, they said, well, what do you think about democracy in Iraq? And he said, well, you know, there's a tendency in the United States to think it's like instant coffee. You pour in the water and leave. And it takes 2 generations at the minimum. And you have to stay. in fact, like the United States did in Germany and Japan. And we're trying to get it done before the next election. I don't think that's a very sound view.
There's something that I want to ask you, because you are the person who, with Ralph Bunche, put peacekeeping together. I remember you telling me once that y'all were sitting around and deciding what color the helmets would be, and you came up with blue. If we're now, today's news, we're confronted with a situation where it's not clear which government we will have to deal with who will grant us the legitimacy to remain there once Iraqi sovereign government. If through circumstances there should be a need for some sort of military mission of the UN, to further the transition from the American presence, let's just assume that the Americans would decide to get out and so on. How would you look at that problem? Would you just say, well, it's not something that the UN could do? Or help us understand how you would think about the problem with regard to whether the UN should do it and how it should do it.
Well, the UN could perfectly easily do it, but it needs two things. It needs resources and it needs money. And it needs a political mandate. I mean, we put on an operation in the Congo in 1960, which it's the third biggest country in Africa. It's the size of the whole of Western Europe. And we did it. It was actually, until it broke up on Cold War lines, it was very effective. But it doesn't have any political support in the United States, and that's very important. The United States is the leading country in the UN, and if it doesn't support things, nothing gets done, though it may change. And we don't have, I mean, the UN is run on a shoestring. When you look at the amount of money that the Department of Defense or NATO spend, it's absolutely breathtaking. I mean, they spend more before breakfast than the whole UN budget for the whole year, and literally. And we don't have that kind of thing. We could have it. I think what the UN ought to have is a rapid reaction force of the best. I mean, something of the quality of a sort of mixture of Delta Force, Special Forces, the British SAS, plus some really good soldiers. People trained to do things without too much fuss and do it better than anybody else. That could perfectly easily be done, but the United States doesn't want that, because it would give the UN too much of a sort of identity of its own. They don't want that. They think it's a terrible idea to have an international force which wasn't specifically under the control of a government. It would be under the control of the Security Council and the Secretary General. But every year there are 3 or 4 cases where they desperately need it. They desperately need it now to secure the international people who are going to go to Iraq to try to get the get the thing on track again so that the Americans can leave, which the United States desperately wants. You can't, if you use, at the moment they have to have security from the coalition, which is the kiss of death. They have to have something which has a UN identity which is not one country. Because the Iraqis have been colonized since the dawn of time. I mean, the Romans tried it, doubtless Alexander the Great tried it, the Turks tried it, everybody's tried it, the British. They're very, very, very touchy about foreigners taking over, and rightly. And you need something different. But at the moment there's no support for this, because governments are deadly scared, it's not just the United States, that the international organization, which they're all members of, would acquire something which had an identity and an ability of its own. They don't like it. But until it has that, it's not going to work very well. And I don't know how many more disasters it's going to take before they realize this, but it'll come in the end, not in my time.
I want to touch on one more topic, and then we'll open the floor to questions, and that is the problem of intelligence. Brian is writing a review essay for the New York Review of Books that's coming out soon, in which he's going to review the Hans Blix book, which he just talked about, and also the Hutton Report, which is the report of the British government on the British appointed by the British government, appointed by the Prime Minister to reach a conclusion about whether the Blair government had sexed up the report, which the whole controversy about that led to the suicide of the biologist there, and so I guess the issue before us is. Let me just ask you this. Do political leaders really want to use intelligence to understand the situation they're confronted with, or do they invariably want to use intelligence to reach the conclusion that they've already reached before they look at the data?
Well, I think this is a rather new situation. I mean, in this last situation over Iraq, both Tony Blair and President Bush absolutely dogmatically stated that they were going into Iraq because Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction which were a threat not just to his neighbors but to the United States. And we had all Condoleezza Rice saying we don't want to learn first about it when we see the mushroom cloud. This is total nonsense. This is the worst kind of junky rhetoric. I don't know what she thought she was doing saying that. So they really were very anxious to have intelligence which backed this up, which is the wrong way around. It seems to me intelligence should come first. And it really became a major, it nearly ruined Tony Blair's career completely, because, I mean, if you read the British intelligence dossier of September 2003, which is what this was all about, which was the one that said that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, mostly chemical and biological, which could be operational within 45 minutes. I mean, I thought it was very weird. Everybody thought it was weird, but Tony Blair asserted this over and over again as a fact. And then it was picked up by Bush and a lot of other junk from that dossier. If you read that dossier today, it's like a fantasy. It looks like a sort of bad joke. Nothing in it is true. But this was what they were running on. And then they asked the intelligence to please produce the intelligence. I think they got it wrong. I think that supposing, well, it's what I've said in this piece actually, supposing Tony Blair was desperately anxious to avoid participating in the adventure in Iraq, and which he was being urged to do by his friend George Bush. So would the intelligence that had come up for the dossier have been anything like what actually appeared in it? Of course it wouldn't. Because every single thing in the dossier says intelligence suggests that, or we are inclined to think that. This is not facts, this is dreaming. And I think that if you're at war, that shouldn't happen. It seems to the president informed us all the other day that he's a war president. Well, if he's a war president, presumably at war, and it's wartime, and in wartime, intelligence is a matter of life and death. It's what either preserves or kills soldiers and nice civilians as well. It is not something that you can monkey around with. It cannot be manipulated, and you cannot go to the intelligence services and tell them, you know, this is the answer we want. We've said this, now please. I mean, I think it's very dangerous, and especially if we're going to go in for preventive operations again. Of all forms of war, preventive wars desperately need the right intelligence. Or you're going to do again what unfortunately we managed to do with one of the nastiest governments in the world, Saddam Hussein, which is to get it completely wrong. And I think the question isn't really whether the intelligence was wrong and what the failure was. The question is, what is the role of intelligence? Is it supposed to be a sort of propaganda outfit, or is it something on which governments base policy? And I would like to see that discussed much more, because I think it's really, you know, you who are young and may go into some branch of the military services, intelligence is desperately important to you. It's what saves the lives of soldiers and airmen and sailors. And it's not something to be fooled around with by a bunch of ambitious politicians.
I can't help mentioning that the first piece that you wrote in the New York Review of Books about 25 years ago was a wartime incident. And I wanted to touch on that for a minute. You were an intelligence officer in the British paratroopers at the end of the war. And this story that we're about to relate is told in the movie A Bridge Too Far, namely, so let's talk a little about that and the lesson you learned from that. You basically, as an intelligence officer, tried to show to the military leadership there was a problem with a plan, and they didn't listen. Tell us a little about that.
Well, this is slightly the opposite situation from what you have today. Well, not altogether, but except that nobody paid any attention to the intelligence either. This was the end of the war, September 1944, at least it was supposed to be the end of the war. And the British and American and Canadian troops had captured Paris and Brussels, and they were stuck on something called the Albert Canal, which is just on the borders of Belgium and Holland, and nothing much was happening. And the Germans were refitting. Montgomery, the British general, was very, very jealous of Patton. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Patton, but there's a wonderful episode which caused this actually in Sicily, when Montgomery announced he was going to take Palermo, and he had this victory parade, and Patton's soldiers were sitting in the bleachers politely applauding. Montgomery never forgot it. And then the same thing happened again after D-Day. Patton broke out of the Cherbourg Peninsula and did this huge kind of armored cavalry charge right down through France, while poor Montgomery was still fighting the Germans in the D-Day zone. So he wanted to get back into public relations-wise with the public. And he conceived, to me, a completely dotty plan, which was to take every parachute and glider troop in the Allied forces, American and British, which was something like 3.5 divisions, and let them take the 3 bridges over the tributaries of the Rhine going through Holland, which are all major rivers. It's where the Rhine divides into 3 large rivers. Take the bridges over these rivers and let the Montgomery's forces pour through Holland into Germany and finish the war. The fact that they didn't have any of the logistics to be able to do this seems not to have occurred to the general. I mean, they didn't have enough gas to get over the bridges, let alone anything else, but still. I mean, this was a completely, to my view, and I was then 24 years old, it seemed to be a completely ludicrous plan. I was the chief intelligence officer of the British Airborne Corps, which was 2 parachute divisions and a lot of special forces. And so I became increasingly alarmed looking at the intelligence. First of all, the anti-aircraft. When we were going to arrive in slow-flying transport planes, after all. And the fact that the British 1st Airborne Division, which is the one in the movie, was going to be on the northern river at Arnhem, on the wrong side of that river, and it was had to be relieved within 4 days if it was going to survive, because they ran out of everything, ammunition, and airborne troops don't have any transport, so that, or they didn't in those days. And nobody would listen. They would say, oh, no, the Germans are finished. It's just a matter of one more push. And we remember 1918 and all this kind of thing. And I said, well, there's no evidence whatsoever that the Germans have stopped fighting. On the contrary, they're on the borders of Germany. Why would they stop fighting there? It's nonsense. It doesn't like that. The German forces had all taken a personal oath to Hitler, incidentally, which not an oath to be taken lightly. And so I got nowhere with that. And then we discovered, the Dutch resistance discovered it first, that the 2 best armored divisions in the German army in the West, which were the 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions, these were the absolutely crack armored divisions of the German army. They'd been messed up in Normandy, and they were refitting just outside Arnhem, which was the place where our chaps were going to drop. And I said, you know, this is really terrible. You cannot drop lightly armed parachutists on top of the 2 best armored divisions in the world. It simply won't do. No, you don't understand. So this is going to be, it's going to go like clockwork. Well, of course it didn't. And I got sent away. I was such a pain in the neck that I was sent away just 2 days before we were due to go on this masquerade. And then the thing went wrong, and I immediately got sent for back. So I had a hell of a job getting there because they were all cut off, but anyhow, there it was. And everybody was extremely polite. And they said, good to see you, old boy. You're looking great. And I said, well, what seems to be going on? But I discovered then one thing, 2 things. One is that if particularly soldiers want to do something which they think is going to be a great piece of military glory, no amount of good intelligence, once they've got going, will stop it. And the other thing I discovered was that it's bad enough to be against something they all want to do, but if you turn out to be right, people hate you with a loathing which is beyond any belief. I never spoke to anyone for about 40 years after that for this thing. But that I think was one general trying to justify. It was a little bit like what Montgomery wanting to finish the war with a brilliant coup under his command, and thereby ignoring the intelligence. This one's a little bit different because the intelligence has been kind of tailored to support a rather fantastic reason for going to war. Anyhow, there we are.
I want to read you what you wrote, actually, because I think it's very relevant to today, and we'll maybe end on this last note. The Arnhem tragedy had a deep and lasting effect on my attitude to life. Before it, I had been trusting and relatively optimistic with a self-confidence that was sometimes excessive. After it, I doubted everything, tended to distrust my own as well as other people's judgment, and became deeply skeptical about the behavior of leaders. I never again could quite be convinced that great enterprises would go as planned or turn out well, or that wisdom and principle were a match for vanity and ambition. So that was a negative conclusion, probably justified. I want to know if you can leave us with an optimistic note in this conversation before we take questions from the floor.
Well, I think I've talked enough. Well, I think, you have to go on trying, that's the thing. And things seem to get easier as you get older. I don't know why that is, or in my case it seems to be the case. But I think it is very important, particularly in public life, to try to hang on to a rigorous analytical approach to the facts of the case and the information that is available, and then try to get more, and not be swept away by some glorious idea we're going to establish democracy in the Middle East or some such thing. That comes later. You can start talking about that when you've really got the thing straight, but it's a good idea to be extremely skeptical about what politicians and other leaders, and generals incidentally, say. Nowadays, generals are the ones who are cautious and the politicians who aren't.
Well, I want to thank Sir Brian very much for taking the time to be here, and thank you very much for participating in this fascinating dialogue.
Thank you very much.